What happens when an innocent 8-year-old girl becomes the target of an officer's racist violence? Watch as a seemingly quiet moment spirals into chaos. The slap that shook a community. Then the unexpected twist of fate strikes back with a vengeance. Will justice prevail, or is karma about to change everything? Stay tuned. In the sweltering heat of a late summer afternoon, 8-year-old Mariama stood at the bus stop, her little fingers clutching the straps of her pink backpack. She was the picture of innocence, lost in a world of her own. She hummed softly, swaying side to side, as the rhythmic click of her shoes on the cracked sidewalk was the only sound breaking the stillness around her. Her school uniform, a faded blue dress, clung to her small frame as sweat trickled down the back of her neck. It wasn't the first day of school, but it felt like the first time her life had started to take shape in a way that made her feel something more. She'd been excited that morning. Her mom, a single parent, had insisted on making breakfast before the sun had fully risen. "A full stomach is a happy heart," Mariama's mother always said, her smile like a warm embrace. It was always the little things that mattered, especially for a young girl like Mariama, who had learned early on that life wasn't always fair. Yet as the afternoon sun beat down on the pavement, that same feeling of excitement began to shift. A chill ran through her spine, though she couldn't understand why. She glanced up at the sky. The clouds were just beginning to gather, swirling in a dark mass. But it wasn't the weather that made her uneasy. It was the atmosphere around her. The sounds of distant traffic, the usual chatter of people heading home, all felt muted. The air was heavy, thick with something unsaid, something Mariama couldn't name but felt deep in her chest. Then, without warning, a police cruiser slowed as it approached the bus stop. The familiar rumble of the engine felt like a sudden shift in the world she knew. The car stopped in front of her, its dark windows casting an impenetrable shadow. Mariama instinctively took a step back, her heart racing in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't afraid of the police, or at least, she never had been. She'd seen them around town, always seemingly so important in their uniformed authority. But today, something about this officer felt different. His eyes met hers through the window, cold, distant, unreadable. The officer didn't make eye contact for long. He looked away as if dismissing her existence, and then spoke into the radio with a low, rasping voice. It was barely audible, but Mariama felt a sense of dread crawl up her spine as she watched the officer's hand twitch near his belt. Her gut twisted, and for a moment, everything felt wrong. Too wrong. Minutes later, the car pulled away. The sounds of the city began to seep back into the air, but Mariama didn't feel any comfort. She couldn't explain it, but the brief encounter had left a mark on her, one she couldn't erase. She tried to shake it off, turning her attention back to the bus stop, but the bus didn't come. Time passed, the weight of the air growing thicker, and the bus still hadn't arrived. She stared down the street, squinting into the setting sun, wondering what was taking it so long. Her mind kept returning to the police cruiser, to that officer's eyes, to the strange tension that had surrounded the moment. Was it fear? Was it just her imagination? She couldn't say, but she knew one thing. Something was coming, something that would forever change her life. A few moments later, the bus finally rounded the corner. It was almost like the world exhaled in relief. As it came to a stop, Mariama climbed aboard, not realizing that the calm before the storm was about to shatter. The bus ride felt longer than it had ever been. Mariama sat at the back, her tiny hands gripping the worn-out fabric of the seat in front of her. The rhythmic hum of the engine seemed to drown out the noise around her, her thoughts tangled in a storm of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had followed her since the moment the officer's eyes met hers. Her heart still raced, but she told herself it was just nerves. Just the way the world felt sometimes, like something was about to go wrong, even when everything seemed perfectly normal. The bus was filled with students, mostly older kids, laughing, joking, unaware of the storm brewing in Mariama's mind. Yet despite their carefree chatter, Mariama couldn't stop thinking about that cop, about the strange, foreboding energy that had surrounded his presence. When the bus finally arrived at her stop, Mariama climbed out, her feet dragging as she made her way down the sidewalk towards her apartment complex. She passed the familiar rows of cars parked along the curb, their engines cooling in the waning daylight. The air had a thickness to it, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, but no one seemed to notice. She turned onto the narrow street that led to her building, feeling an odd sense of vulnerability as she walked. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like dark fingers. The world was quieter now, more tense, and Mariama felt it deep in her bones. And then, it happened. The sound of tires screeching against asphalt echoed down the street. A police car, the same one from earlier, barreled toward her, its sirens cutting through the silence like a blade. Mariama froze. She didn't know why, but the same feeling that had gripped her earlier came rushing back. Her heart thudded in her chest, a dull ache filling her stomach. The car screeched to a halt in front of her, and without a moment's hesitation, the officer, his face now visible through the open window, lunged out of the car. The world seemed to stop, the noise of the city fading away, leaving only the echo of his footsteps. Mariama didn't have time to react. "Get over here, girl!" the officer shouted, his voice sharp and menacing. His hand shot out, gripping her arm with an iron-like force. Before she could even gasp, his palm cracked against her cheek with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. The slap was sharp. It was like nothing Mariama had ever felt before. It wasn't just the pain. It was the way it made her feel small, powerless, invisible. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her body went numb, and all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears, the pounding of her heart. The world seemed to spin as the officer pulled away from her, his eyes cold, calculating. He didn't speak, but the contempt in his gaze was clear. He was a man used to wielding power over people like her, and for some reason he seemed to enjoy it. Mariama stumbled backward, a tear slipping down her cheek, but she didn't dare to look up at him. The anger, the shame, it all welled up inside her, and she was terrified that if she opened her mouth, she would burst. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shout, but no words came. Only silence. The officer didn't care. Without another word, he turned and climbed back into his car, speeding off as quickly as he'd arrived. And just like that, the storm that had been brewing in the back of Mariama's mind had broken, and it left destruction in its wake. She stood there, staring at the place where the car had been, as the sounds of the city began to creep back into her awareness. The normalcy of the world felt like a distant memory. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the slap, or the way it made her feel as though she didn't matter. The street around her continued on, people walking by as if nothing had happened. No one stopped, no one even looked her way. But for Mariama, nothing would ever be the same again. Mariama's hand trembled as she stepped into the apartment. She could still feel the sting of the slap on her cheek, but worse than that was the cold, empty feeling that now settled in her chest. The world outside hadn't stopped. People went on with their lives, unaware of what had just happened, but Mariama knew that she couldn't just walk away from it. She couldn't pretend it didn't matter. Her mother, Chica, was in the kitchen, her back turned as she hummed a familiar song. When Mariama entered, her mother didn't immediately notice the tension in the air. She smiled as she set the pot of stew on the counter, her voice soft but steady. "Hi, baby. How was school today?" Mariama didn't answer right away. Her throat felt tight. The words stuck somewhere between anger and pain. She wanted to tell her mother everything about the officer, about the slap, about the rage she felt boiling inside. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. Instead, her eyes filled with tears that spilled over before she could stop them. Chica turned, startled. She rushed to Mariama's side, her arms enveloping her in a protective embrace. "What happened? Baby, talk to me. What's wrong?" Mariama leaned into her mother, her chest heaving as she finally let the tears flow freely. "Mama, he slapped me." The words felt surreal even as they left her lips. The idea of her own mother hearing this, of anyone hearing this, seemed impossible, like it had happened to someone else, not her. Chica's face went pale, her hands gripping Mariama's shoulders with a force that betrayed her calm exterior. Who did this to you?" Mariama swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "A cop, a police officer. He slapped me, Mama." Chica's eyes widened, and for a moment she was silent as though processing the words didn't seem real. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Chica stepped back and looked at her daughter, searching her face for any sign that this might be a misunderstanding, some mistake. But when her gaze landed on the raw redness of Mariama's cheek, she didn't need more evidence. "Where is he? What happened?" Chica asked, her voice now a mixture of disbelief and growing fury. Mariama's chest tightened again, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "He just left, like nothing happened." Her mother closed her eyes, her jaw tightening as the anger started to build. She took a deep breath, struggling to contain her emotions, but Mariama could feel the storm brewing inside her mother too. It wasn't just the shock of it all. It was the truth that both of them had known for far too long. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a part of a much larger, systemic problem that they had been forced to live with every day. After a long pause, Chica took Mariama's hand in hers, her grip firm but gentle. "This isn't right. This isn't how it should be." "I know," Mariama whispered. Her voice trembled. "But what can we do? What can anyone do?" Chica was quiet for a moment, her thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. She knew the risks. She knew the dangers of standing up against an officer. But more than that, she knew what it felt like to have your dignity stripped away piece by piece until you weren't sure who you were anymore. "I'll take care of it," Chica said finally, her voice steady, resolute. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Mariama felt the weight of her mother's words, the sense of responsibility that filled the air. But it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person who had ever been hurt, every person who had ever been silenced. Her mother's promise wasn't just a promise to Mariama. It was a promise to everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. As the night dragged on, the weight of what had happened settled into Mariama's bones. She knew that the slap was only the beginning of something much larger. The ripples would spread, touching more lives than she could ever imagine. There would be consequences, yes, but there would also be change. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Chica picked it up, her expression growing harder as she listened. "I'm going down there tomorrow," Chica said into the phone. "Yes, I'll bring the papers." Mariama knew that the decision had already been made. Her mother wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let this be just another story in a long list of injustices that had been ignored. And for the first time since the slap, Mariama felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. Maybe, just maybe, the ripple effects of this moment could lead to something bigger, something that could change everything. The next morning, Mariama woke to the dull hum of the city outside their apartment. The sun had barely risen, but the weight of the previous night still lingered, like a storm cloud hanging low in the sky. She felt it in her bones, the unrest, the raw edge of something about to break. Her mother had been on the phone all night, speaking to lawyers, making plans, but nothing felt real yet, not until the world knew. Chica walked into the living room with a tired smile, but her eyes were sharp, determined. "We're meeting with the lawyer today," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "We'll take the first steps, but I need you to be strong, Mariama." Mariama nodded, but it was hard to focus. She still couldn't shake the image of the officer's hand on her cheek, the way he looked at her, as if she was nothing but a nuisance in his day. She kept replaying that moment over and over in her head, wondering how she could have reacted differently. But there was no time for that now. There was only the next step, the next move, and right now it was about telling her story. Chica left to make a few more calls, and Mariama went to the small kitchen, trying to distract herself. The coffee pot gurgled quietly in the background, but Mariama couldn't bring herself to care about much beyond the knot in her stomach. Her mind kept drifting back to the slap, to how easily it had come, how quickly he had reached for her, and how no one had said a word. She had been treated like a shadow, a problem to be silenced. The doorbell rang, breaking her thoughts. Mariama opened the door cautiously, unsure of who would be there. Standing on the other side was her neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, an older black woman who had lived across the hall for as long as Mariama could remember. Mrs. Ellis had always been kind, but today her face was grim. "I heard about what happened," Mrs. Ellis said, her voice low and full of concern. I can't believe it. I'm so sorry, child." Mariama felt the lump rise in her throat again. She hadn't expected anyone to know so quickly. Word spread fast in their building, but the reality of it was still shocking. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," Mariama whispered. "I don't know what to do." Mrs. Ellis stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind her. "You don't have to know yet, but you need to stand strong. You need to let them know you won't be quiet. You're not just fighting for you, Mariama. You're fighting for every child, every mother who's had to deal with this. We've all been there." Mariama looked at her, her eyes filling with tears. She hadn't considered that before. She'd been so wrapped up in her own pain, in her own anger, that she hadn't seen the bigger picture. But Mrs. Ellis was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had been built on fear, on control. It was about the countless others who had been silenced and forgotten. I'm scared, Mariama admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Mrs. Ellis took her hand, her grip firm and steady. You are. You've already been strong just by speaking out. Now you keep going. Before Mariama could respond, there was a knock at the door. This time, it was Chica, her face stern but ready. She'd been on the phone with the lawyer for most of the morning, preparing for what was coming next. It's time, Chica said. We need to go. Mariama nodded, wiping her eyes and following her mother out of the apartment. As they walked down the hall to the car, Mariama could feel the weight of the moment settling in her chest. This was it, the beginning of the unraveling, the beginning of everything falling apart and then, hopefully, coming together. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let the fear of the unknown hold her back. When they reached the lawyer's office, they were greeted by a woman in her mid-30s, sharp and businesslike. She introduced herself as Sarah Roberts and immediately got to work. Tell me everything, she said, sitting across from Mariama, her notepad in hand. As Mariama recounted the details of what happened, the officer's sudden aggression, the harshness of the slap, the way the crowd had stood in stunned silence, Sarah nodded, her expression grave. This is serious, Sarah said when Mariama finished. But it's not going to be easy. The police don't just back down. They'll fight us every step of the way. Mariama felt her stomach twist. The weight of the situation, the magnitude of what they were about to face seemed to crush her, but she had come this far. She wasn't going to turn back now. We'll do what we have to do, Chica said firmly, her eyes locked on Sarah's. This is not just about one slap, it's about the years of injustice. We won't be quiet. Mariama didn't know how this would all play out. She didn't know how many doors they would have to knock on, how many people would tell them it wasn't worth it. But one thing was certain, they were starting something that couldn't be stopped. The unraveling had begun. Mariama sat in the small, sterile office of the lawyer's office, the silence pressing on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, her mind still replaying the events that had led her here, flashbacks to the moment when the slap had landed, when everything had changed. But it wasn't just the slap that haunted her anymore. It was the silence that followed, the long, suffocating quiet that seemed to drown out her voice. But now, that voice was about to be heard. I'm ready, Mariama whispered, her voice small but filled with an unfamiliar strength. Sarah, the lawyer, looked up from her notes, her gaze steady and encouraging. You don't have to do this alone, Mariama. We'll help you. But it's your voice that matters the most. Mariama nodded, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. She had spent so many years learning to stay quiet, to let things slide, to believe that speaking up was dangerous. Her mother had taught her to be careful, to stay in the background, to avoid making waves. But that had all changed when she had been slapped. The world would never hear her if she stayed quiet now. I want to tell my story, Mariama said, her voice shaking slightly but growing steadier with each word. Not just about what happened to me. I want to tell them about all of us, about how it feels to be treated like we don't matter. Sarah gave a small nod of approval. We can do that, but we need to make sure your words are heard. We can take this to the press, get the story out there, but you have to decide if you're ready for that. The world is listening now. Mariama's heart raced in her chest. She had no idea what to expect. She didn't know what it meant to have the world listening, but the thought terrified her. What if they didn't believe her? What if they turned it all into something else? What if they twisted her words, made her the villain in her own story? But as she sat there, thinking of the girl who had been slapped, of all the other girls who had suffered in silence, something shifted inside her. She thought of her mother's words. We fight, even when it's hard. I'm ready, she said again, more firmly this time. They moved quickly. By the time Mariama and her mother stepped out of the lawyer's office, Sarah had already contacted a local news outlet that specialized in civil rights issues. The reporter, a black woman named Tanya, had heard about the incident through a friend of a friend and had agreed to meet with them immediately. They weren't waiting for justice to be handed to them. They were going to take it. Mariama felt her pulse quicken as they arrived at the small cafe where Tanya had asked them to meet. She could see the camera equipment set up in the corner, and her stomach twisted in knots. She wasn't used to the spotlight. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. But this was different. This was something that could change everything. This was her chance to make the world see, to make them hear. Tanya greeted them warmly, but there was a no-nonsense professionalism in the way she moved, in the way she set up the camera, adjusted the lights, and prepared Mariama for the interview. "You don't have to say everything in one go," Tanya said kindly. "Take your time, speak from the heart. What happened to you matters, your voice matters." Mariama nodded, swallowing hard. Her mother was sitting beside her, her hand resting on Mariama's knee. The warmth of her touch grounded her, gave her strength. She could feel her mother's steady presence, could hear her calm voice in her mind. "We're in this together." The camera came on, and the world seemed to disappear, leaving only the questions, the microphone, and Mariama's trembling hands. "Mariama," Tanya began, her voice soft but direct. "I know this isn't easy, but we want to hear your story. Tell us what happened that day." Mariama closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the heat of the sun, the crowd that had watched in silence, and the officer's hard, unforgiving hand. Then she began to speak. "It was just supposed to be a normal day. I was walking with my mom and we were on our way home," Mariama began. "But when we got to the corner, there was this officer. He was yelling at someone else, but then he looked at me. I didn't even know what I did wrong. I was just standing there. I was just a kid. But he reached out and he hit me." Mariama paused, her breath catching in her throat. The emotion surged, threatening to choke her, but she forced herself to continue. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't even cry at first. I just froze. But then I thought, what if this happens to someone else? What if they don't have the strength to speak up?" Her voice trembled as the words spilled out, each one harder than the last, but each one liberating her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just talking about the slap. She was talking about everything. Everything she had kept hidden inside her. Everything they had all kept hidden inside. When she finished, there was silence in the cafe. Tanya nodded, her expression serious but respectful. "Mariama," Tanya said softly, "your story is going to reach so many people. This is how change begins." Mariama wasn't sure she believed her yet, but as the interview continued, she began to feel a small shift inside herself. Her voice, once small and unsure, was growing louder. The world was listening now, and she was ready to speak. Mariama's voice echoed in her ears long after the interview was over, but the silence at home was deafening. She had stepped into the world's spotlight, sharing her pain, her trauma, and now she was left to face the aftermath, not just with strangers, but with her family. And that, more than anything, was what terrified her. When she walked into the small apartment, her mother was sitting on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed from the tears she had quietly shed in the kitchen. Mariama's heart clenched as she caught the look in her mother's eyes, a mix of pride and fear, but mostly fear. "Mom?" Mariama's voice was tentative, unsure. Her mother didn't respond at first. She simply stared ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It was the kind of silence that could stretch into infinity, thick with words unspoken. Mariama had never felt it so strongly before. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Mariama. I don't know if this is the right thing to do." Mariama's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? You've told them everything, all of it. You've made it real. But now I'm scared for you." Her mother's voice cracked. "They'll come after you. They'll come after us. Do you understand that?" Mariama felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. Her mother had spent years keeping them safe, teaching her the importance of silence, of avoiding trouble. Her whole life had been about protecting her daughter from the harsh realities of the world. And now, Mariama had ripped that safety net away. I just wanted people to know the truth," Mariama said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't pretend nothing happened." Her mother's face twisted with a mix of anger and sorrow. "But you don't understand, Mariama. You don't understand what this world is capable of. I've been through this before. I've seen it. I know how they react when we speak up. You don't think this will change anything, do you? It will only make things worse." Mariama's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward, reaching out for her mother. "I'm not trying to make it worse, Mom. I just want to make it better. I want to make sure it doesn't happen again." Her mother's hand shot up, holding her off, a silent barrier that Mariama had never seen before. "But this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. Do you think I don't know how dangerous this is? That I haven't watched people I care about be torn apart for standing up? The words hit Mariama like a slap, and she recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't realized the full extent of what her mother had been carrying, the weight of the fears she had never shared. She had been so focused on what she had gone through, she hadn't stopped to think about how it was tearing her mother apart too. I know this is hard, Mariama said quietly, her voice shaky but firm. But I don't want to be afraid anymore. I can't live my life like this. I won't. For a moment, her mother's gaze softened. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from Mariama's face before slowly pulling her daughter into an embrace. I wish I could protect you from this, her mother whispered, her voice breaking. But you're right. You can't live in fear forever. Just promise me. Promise me you'll be careful. Mariama's eyes closed as she nodded, holding onto her mother tighter than ever before. I promise. But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. What did careful mean now? Was it possible to be careful when the entire system was stacked against you? When even speaking the truth could bring consequences too terrible to imagine? She didn't know the answer, but the weight of her mother's worry sat heavy on her chest. Later that night, after the exhaustion from the interview had worn off, Mariama lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the only sound in the room. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them able to bring peace. She thought about the anger in her mother's eyes, the fear that had been hiding beneath the surface for so long, and how she just shattered the last thread of security that had kept them both safe. She could hear the arguments in her mind, the sound of her mother's voice pleading for her to stay silent, to keep quiet, to not stir the hornet's nest. But Mariama's heart was heavy with a different truth. She couldn't unhear what had been said. She couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, not now. It was then that the true weight of her actions hit her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She wasn't just standing up for the girl she used to be. She was fighting for her family, for her mother's peace, and for every person who had ever been silenced. But at what cost? Mariama turned onto her side, trying to quell the tears that threatened to spill. She wasn't sure how much longer she could carry this burden, this responsibility to speak out, to change the world, and yet to protect the people she loved from the very same world. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, the fear in it too real to ignore. She had taken the first step, but where would it lead? Could the world handle her truth? Or would they simply destroy everything she had ever known in the process? As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the echoes of that slap, of her mother's cries, and of the growing storm outside seemed to swirl around her, a constant reminder that no one, not even her, was truly prepared for the fight ahead. Mariama hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly, but when the news broke, it was like a wildfire. The image of the slap, the brutal, unprovoked slap, was everywhere, on every news outlet, in every conversation, even in the schools. Whispers followed her like shadows. The accusations came fast, like arrows aimed directly at her. The first one came from a local politician who, during a press conference, declared that Mariama had embellished the details of the incident. His words were sharp, dismissive, aimed at discrediting everything she had fought so hard to reveal. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A desperate attempt to stir division and create chaos where none exists." Mariama's stomach twisted as she watched the broadcast on her phone. There it was, the weaponization of her trauma. Her truth was being ripped apart in real time. She felt sick, her mind racing as she tried to grasp how everything had shifted from her fight for justice to a public spectacle. But it wasn't just politicians who were attacking her. Social media was a battleground of conflicting narratives. Some supported her, hailed her as a hero, while others painted her as a liar, as a troublemaker. The hashtags that had once been filled with solidarity, #justice for Mariama, #truth and reconciliation, were now being flooded with venomous insults. They called her attention-seeking and disrespectful. The words were like daggers, and with each one the walls of her mind began to crack. The phone rang late one night, shattering the silence of her room. Mariama picked it up, her heart racing in her chest. It was her mother. Her voice was strained, filled with a panic she hadn't heard before. "They're coming, Mariama," her mother said, her voice barely audible. "They're saying we're lying, that this whole thing is made up. The neighbors are talking, and now..." Now they're starting to look at us like we're the problem. Mariama could feel the heat of anger rise in her chest, but there was also an icy fear, one she had hoped she'd never have to face again. This was the reality her mother had warned her about, the reality of speaking out, of challenging the system, of making herself a target. "I don't know what to do," her mother continued, her voice cracking with fear. "You should never have said anything. Now they're calling us the family that lies. They're saying we want to ruin his career. They're saying you're just trying to make money off of this." "Mom, I didn't," Mariama started, but her mother interrupted. "You think I don't know what they'll do next? They'll try to take everything from us. They'll find a way to make us pay. They always do." Her mother's voice was filled with helplessness. "I can't protect you from this, Mariama. This world isn't like what we thought it was." The phone call ended abruptly, and Mariama was left in the stillness of her room, the weight of the accusation hanging in the air like smoke. The world outside felt like a different place now. What had started as an act of courage had turned into a nightmare. The very people who had promised to support her were now questioning her integrity. She thought about the police officer, the one who had slapped her. Was he really that bad? Was he just following orders? Did he even deserve this? She had told her truth, but now she wasn't sure if it mattered. She wasn't sure if anyone would believe her, if they would believe them, the family torn apart by a world that didn't seem to care. Her heart ached at the thought of what was to come next. The smear campaigns, the public trials, the relentless accusations. In the days that followed, the tension in their home was palpable. Her mother grew more withdrawn, quieter, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. Mariama tried to block out the accusations, the noise, the hate. But it wasn't just the outside world that was attacking her now. The attacks were coming from within, from the people she loved the most. Her own family was starting to fracture under the pressure. At school, the whispers didn't stop. Some classmates avoided her entirely, while others approached her with questions, with doubts. They wanted to know the real story. They wanted to know if it was true. Was she lying? Was she exaggerating? Her best friend Jasmine had pulled her aside one day in the hallway, looking at her with wide eyes. "Are you sure about this, Mariama?" Jasmine's voice was a mixture of concern and disbelief. "I mean, this isn't just about you anymore. You've got the whole school watching, the whole town even. What if it's not what you think? What if you misunderstood?" Mariama had stared at her friend in shock. "I didn't misunderstand anything. I know what happened." Jasmine had looked away, biting her lip. I don't know. I don't want to see you hurt. I don't want to see you thrown under the bus for something you didn't do." The doubt in her friend's voice hurt more than anything else. She had expected her support, her unwavering belief in her, but now even that was being tested. Later that evening, as Mariama lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt as if the walls were closing in on her from all sides. The accusations, the pressure, the doubts. She wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. She could hear her mother's voice in her head, telling her she'd made a mistake, telling her to be silent, to let it go before it was too late. But deep down, Mariama knew she couldn't turn back now. She had spoken her truth. She had taken the first step, and even if the world turned against her, even if her own family couldn't understand, she would stand by her decision. She had no choice. Mariama had never imagined it would come to this. Standing in front of the entire world, eyes locked onto her, the weight of an entire community's judgment bearing down on her shoulders. She had hoped for a quiet resolution, a way for the truth to simply be acknowledged and for things to move forward. But as the accusations grew louder, as the smear campaigns intensified, she knew there was no escaping this moment. The public confrontation was inevitable. The day had arrived, the day when she would face the officer, face the media, and face the truth of what had happened, all while the world watched. The scene was set in a small, dimly lit conference room at the local courthouse, the kind that was typically reserved for routine legal proceedings. But today it was filled with cameras, journalists, and reporters, all clamoring for a piece of the story. A backdrop of bright lights illuminated Mariama, her family seated behind her, trying to mask their unease with quiet resolve. The police officer, Officer Harris, was sitting on the opposite side of the room, his face a mask of defiance. He had been called in to answer for his actions, but the rumors, the half-truths, and the lies that surrounded the case had already begun to build a fortress around him. The tension between the two of them, Mariama and Officer Harris, was palpable. a silent battle of wills that had been building ever since the moment his hand had struck her cheek. Mariama's heart raced as she stepped forward to take the microphone, the weight of the world suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. She glanced briefly at her mother, who gave her a nod of encouragement, but the look in her eyes, so full of worry, so full of fear, reminded Mariama just how high the stakes were. She cleared her throat and began, her voice shaking at first but gaining strength with each word. "Ladies and gentlemen," she started, addressing the room full of reporters. "I never asked for this. I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted to be heard. I just wanted what happened to me to matter. But now it's about something bigger. It's about accountability. It's about the truth." There was a slight quiver in her voice, but she held her ground, refusing to let the weight of the moment crush her. She had come this far. She wasn't going to stop now. The journalists were scribbling notes, their cameras capturing every word, every expression. They had already made up their minds about her, just as they had about Officer Harris. The public had been fed a narrative, one of lies, half-truths, and manipulations. And now, they were waiting to see who would break, who would fall apart, who would be exposed as the liar they had all been led to believe. Mariama paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle in the air. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, judging, waiting, searching for weakness. She knew the stakes. She knew what would happen if she faltered, but she couldn't falter now. "I was 8 years old when it happened," she continued, her voice steady, though the memory of that day still stung like it had been yesterday. "I was just a little girl sitting on the sidewalk with my friends when I was approached by Officer Harris. I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't causing trouble, but he slapped me. Hard, without warning, without provocation." She paused, the room falling silent. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Mariama could hear her own heartbeat thumping in her ears. She was standing there, revealing the most vulnerable part of herself to the world, knowing full well how many people were waiting to tear her down. But she couldn't stop now. The slap wasn't just physical, it was humiliating. It was an act of power, a reminder that some people believe they can do whatever they want because of the uniform they wear. Her words were sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "I am not here to destroy someone's career. I am not here to ruin a man's life. I am here because what happened to me, what happens to kids like me, matters. And it's time for us to be heard. It's time for change." Mariama's chest rose and fell with each breath as she finished speaking. She stood there, waiting for the response, waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge her pain. The silence in the room was deafening. She could feel the skepticism, the judgment, the doubt, but she refused to back down. This was her truth. And no matter how much the world tried to tear her down, she would stand by it. From the other side of the room, Officer Harris stood. His face, cold and unreadable, met hers with a gaze that could have cut through steel. He adjusted his uniform, clearing his throat before stepping forward to speak. "Miss Smith," he began, his voice calm but dripping with disdain. "I understand that you're upset, but the way you're telling this story, it doesn't match the facts. I never struck you. There was no need. You were a part of an unlawful assembly, and I had every right to ask you to disperse, but I did not lay a hand on you." The audacity in his words was almost too much for Mariama to bear. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the anger rising again, the same anger she had felt that day when his hand had struck her, when no one had been there to help her, when no one had believed her. But now, she had a voice, and she would use it. "I know what happened," Mariama shot back, her voice trembling with the force of her emotions. "You can stand there and deny it all you want, but I know the truth, and the world will know it too." Officer Harris's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak again, the moderator stepped in to keep the peace. The room buzzed with tension, reporters whispering under their breath, cameras capturing every moment. The confrontation had only just begun, and already the divide between truth and lies seemed insurmountable. As the cameras flashed, as the reporters continued to question both Mariama and Officer Harris, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a matter of one girl's word against one officer's. It had become a public reckoning, a showdown that would determine not only the fate of one officer, but the fate of an entire community. Mariama had no idea what would happen next. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the truth be silenced. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Mariama's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing as the final verdict loomed closer. The room was filled with people who had come to witness the trial that had captivated the nation. Some were there for justice, others for the spectacle, but everyone was waiting to see if the truth would finally come to light. Mariama sat in the front row, her mother beside her, both of them bracing themselves for what came next. Her mother's hand rested gently on her shoulder, a silent reminder that they had come this far, and they could make it through whatever came after. For weeks, they had been forced to relive the horrors of that day, the slap, the pain, the humiliation, the accusations. But this moment, the moment of justice, was what they had been fighting for. It was the final test, the moment where they would either see a world where truth prevailed or a world where power and lies ruled. Officer Harris had already been called to the stand, his defense team presenting their arguments with polished precision, painting him as a hero just doing his job, someone who acted out of necessity to keep the peace. But Mariama had stood firm, her truth undeniable, and she had spoken to the world with a clarity and courage that no one could ignore. The world had heard her. Now the question was, would the justice system listen? The judge, an older man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, had taken his seat, his gavel resting heavily on the desk in front of him. His stern expression showed little emotion, but Mariama could sense the weight of his decision. This would be the moment that determined the direction the story would take, not just for her, but for so many others who had been wronged by those in power. Mariama Smith, you may now make your final statement, the judge's voice rang out, breaking the silence like the snap of a twig. Mariama stood, her legs trembling beneath her, but her resolve as solid as steel. She turned to face the room. Her voice was steady, but beneath the calm surface, her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. She had fought for this moment. Now she would take it. Your Honor, members of the court, Mariama began, her voice clear and unwavering. I don't want anyone to think that I am here to tear down anyone's life. I am here to stand up for what is right. I am here because a child, an innocent child, was wronged by a system that was supposed to protect her. Her words echoed in the courtroom, a quiet defiance that seemed to pierce the air. Her eyes, burning with determination, met the judge's gaze as though trying to communicate the weight of her conviction. I was just a little girl, but what happened to me is real, she continued. The slap wasn't just a physical injury. It was a reminder that sometimes, when you're black, when you're poor, when you don't have power, the system that is supposed to protect you will instead use you as a punching bag. It's not just about me, Your Honor. It's about every person who's been hurt, who's been silenced, who's been told that their pain doesn't matter. The words were coming more easily now, the frustration and sorrow of the past weeks turning into a force that propelled her forward. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some skeptical, some sympathetic, but it didn't matter. This was her truth. This was her moment. Officer Harris may say he didn't strike me, but I know what happened, and the world knows what happened. I am here today not just for me, but for every child who has ever felt the sting of injustice, who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or worthless. They matter, we matter, and the truth, our truth, has to matter. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she steadied herself, taking a deep breath. This was her moment to be heard. She would not let it slip away. There was a long pause as the judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes never leaving her face. He was calm, but his mind was racing. He had heard the testimonies, seen the evidence, and now he had to make a decision that would not only impact Officer Harris's life, but would send a message to the world about the value of truth, justice, and accountability. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured but firm. Mariama Smith, the judge began, what you have spoken today is powerful. It is not just the voice of one person, but the voice of a community, a generation, and a nation that has been forced to reckon with the realities of injustice. You have shown immense courage in standing up for yourself and for those who have no voice. I commend you for that. Mariama's chest swelled with emotion, but she kept her composure. She had fought for this moment, and now she would hear the judgment that would shape her future. The evidence presented in this court, the judge continued, has made it clear that the actions of Officer Harris were unjustifiable. The law is meant to protect all citizens, regardless of their race or background. What happened to you, Mariama, is unacceptable, and today we will hold those in power accountable for their actions." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Mariama felt her heart stop for a split second. Was this really happening? Had justice finally come for her? The judge's voice was strong and unwavering as he delivered the final blow. "Officer Harris is hereby found guilty of misconduct in office and is to be held accountable for his actions. The court has spoken." The words reverberated in Mariama's ears, and for a moment the room seemed to blur. Her eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, not wanting to break down in front of everyone. Her mother's hand found hers again, squeezing it tight, both of them knowing that this moment, this small but significant victory, meant more than anything they had ever imagined. Justice had been served. But it wasn't just about Officer Harris. It was about the message this sent to the world, that no one, no matter their position or power, was above the law. That the voices of those who had been silenced for so long would no longer be ignored. And in that moment, Mariama knew that she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever suffered at the hands of a broken system. The courtroom had emptied, the air now thick with the weight of a decision made. Mariama walked out with her head held high, her mother's arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a sense of quiet victory in the air. But even in this moment of triumph, something else lingered, a gnawing feeling, the sensation that this was only the beginning of a much larger, more profound change. As they made their way to the car, her mind wandered, still lost in the echoes of the judge's final words. Guilty. She hadn't fully processed the weight of those words until now, until the moment the adrenaline had begun to wear off. The world had heard her, seen her, and now there was no going back. The fight had changed everything, for her family, and for those who had always felt silenced. But as much as the victory was sweet, the reality of what came next still loomed large. She wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. No, this was just the opening act. The first steps had been taken, but the road ahead would be long and fraught with struggles. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows as the city streets began to fill with people returning to their lives. But for Mariama, everything felt different now. The world felt both heavier and more expansive, like a door had opened that she hadn't realized was even there. Just as they reached the car, Mariama's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her heart skipped. It was a news alert. The headline read, "Officer Harris arrested in connection with multiple cases of misconduct." Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be a coincidence. The news was spreading fast. What had once been a single isolated incident had now exploded into a series of revelations. It turned out that Officer Harris's violent tendencies weren't isolated to Mariama. He had been involved in numerous incidents of misconduct, many of which had gone unnoticed or unreported until now. The truth was coming to light in a way that no one had expected. Mariama's mother stared at her, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and vindication. "Is this real?" she asked softly. Mariama nodded, her voice trembling. Karma always finds a way to show up." Her words felt heavy, laden with both relief and a strange, quiet sense of dread. It wasn't just that Officer Harris had been exposed. It was that this moment was the culmination of a larger truth. His actions weren't just an isolated failure of justice. They were part of a much bigger systemic problem. As the news continued to break, a wave of shock spread through the city. Harris had been a trusted officer, a figure of authority in a community that had never questioned his power, until now. It was as if the world had been holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. And now that moment had arrived. News outlets began to report on the multiple victims who had come forward, each story a mirror of Mariama's own. There was the single mother who had been beaten in a similar fashion, the young man wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit, the elderly woman who had been falsely detained for no reason other than her race. All of them had lived in fear, isolated in their pain, until now. Mariama stood there, feeling a mix of triumph and sadness. Yes, Officer Harris was finally going to face consequences. But as the faces of those victims flashed through her mind, she realized that the fight wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. It was about the people who had been silenced for too long, who had borne the weight of injustice alone, in the shadows. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her best friend, Alex. You did it, Mariama. You're a hero. You've changed the world. Mariama stared at the message for a long moment, the weight of the words sinking in. Hero. She hadn't felt like a hero. She had felt like a young girl who had been wronged, like someone who had been broken and then put back together by sheer willpower. But now, maybe, just maybe, there was more to it. Maybe this fight, her fight, had done something bigger than just righting one wrong. She looked at her mother, who smiled back at her. It wasn't a smile of celebration, but one of understanding. Her mother had always known that the journey would be long and painful, but now finally they could begin to breathe. But the most surprising thing was how fast the world had turned. In an instant, the public opinion had shifted, with Harris becoming the embodiment of every abuse of power that had been allowed to slip through the cracks for years. Now, the pressure was mounting. How would the police department, the city officials, and the people in power respond to this revelation? It wasn't over. In many ways, this was just the beginning. Mariama had no illusions about that. She knew the backlash would come. She knew that for every person celebrating justice, there would be others, those who feared change, who would push back against it. But the winds had shifted. The truth was out in the open, and there was no going back. Karma had come for Officer Harris, but it wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had been allowed to run unchecked for far too long. It was about a nation that had finally begun to reckon with its own history, its own brokenness. And in that reckoning, Mariama Smith had become a voice that could no longer be ignored. In the stillness of that moment, Mariama realized that sometimes it isn't just about facing the people who have wronged you. It's about facing the system that allows those wrongs to persist. And that fight would not end today. It would continue until the world had truly changed, until justice was not a rarity, but a given. Karma had struck, but the work was far from done.